What happens when Hollywood's most respected actress meets late-night television's most unpredictable host? You won't believe what unfolds when Meryl Streep sits down with Jimmy Kimmel for what was supposed to be a routine promotional interview. This isn't just another celebrity mishap. This is the moment that shattered the veneer of polite late-night television and exposed the darker side of entertainment industry politics. What started as casual banter quickly spiraled into the most explosive confrontation in talk show history, leaving audiences stunned and social media in absolute chaos. Before we get into this incredible story, make sure you hit that subscribe button and drop a comment below, because you're not going to believe what unfolds when one of cinema's greatest talents comes face to face with a host who clearly crossed every line imaginable. The atmosphere in Studio 6A was electric as Meryl Streep made her entrance to thunderous applause. Dressed in an elegant navy blazer, she carried herself with the poise that had made her a legend across 5 decades of filmmaking. The audience was on their feet, and even Kimmel seemed genuinely excited as he stood to greet her. But beneath the surface pleasantries, tension was already brewing, and it all started with the very first question. "Meryl, thank you so much for being here," Kimmel began, settling back into his chair with that familiar smirk. "I have to ask, you've been pretty vocal about politics lately. Some people are saying maybe actors should stick to acting. What do you think about that?" The question hung in the air like a loaded weapon. Streep's smile never wavered, but her eyes sharpened instantly. "Well, Jimmy, I think that's an interesting perspective from someone who built their career making jokes about current events every single night." The audience chuckled nervously, but Kimmel's expression shifted. "That's different though, isn't it? I mean, I'm a comedian. People expect me to have opinions. But when you give speeches at award shows, aren't you kind of forcing your views on people who just want to be entertained?" "Forcing?" Streep repeated, her voice carrying a dangerous edge. "I wasn't aware that expressing concern for democracy and human rights constituted force. Perhaps you could clarify what you mean by that." Kimmel shifted uncomfortably but pressed on. "Look, I'm just saying, and don't get me wrong, I respect what you do, but don't you think there's something a little privileged about lecturing regular Americans from your mansion in Connecticut?" The studio fell deadly silent. Even the band members exchanged glances. Streep sat perfectly still for a moment, processing what had just been said. When she spoke, her voice was measured but ice-cold. "Jimmy, are you suggesting that having achieved success in my field somehow disqualifies me from caring about my country? Or are you implying that because I've worked hard and been fortunate, I should remain silent while I watch democracy crumble?" "I'm not saying you should be silent," Kimmel backpedaled, but his tone remained confrontational. "I'm just wondering if maybe, the average person watching this show relates more to someone like me than someone who makes $20 million a movie." The audience was now visibly uncomfortable. Some people were whispering to each other, others sat in stunned silence. Streep leaned forward slightly, her legendary composure beginning to crack. "Someone like you?" she repeated slowly. "Jimmy, you make more money in a year hosting this show than most Americans will see in a lifetime. Your net worth is in the hundreds of millions. So please, enlighten me. What exactly makes you more relatable than me?" Kimmel's face flushed red. "At least I didn't grow up in elite circles. At least I understand what it's like to struggle." "Elite circles?" Streep's voice rose for the first time. "Jimmy, I grew up in a middle-class family in New Jersey. My father was a pharmaceutical executive. My mother was a commercial artist. I worked in restaurants and as a typist to pay for acting classes. I earned every single thing I have through decades of hard work. Meanwhile, you've built an empire making fun of people and situations you clearly don't understand." The tension was now palpable throughout the entire studio. Camera operators were getting nervous glances from their director. The audience sat frozen, unsure whether to laugh, clap, or remain silent. But Kimmel, instead of backing down, doubled down on his attack. But come on, Meryl. You have to admit there's something tone-deaf about celebrities telling working class Americans how to vote while you're accepting awards in designer gowns that cost more than their annual salary. Streep's composure finally snapped. She turned in her chair to face him directly, her voice now carrying the full force of her theatrical training. Tone-deaf? Jimmy, what's tone-deaf is a talk show host who makes his living off cheap shots and manufactured controversy lecturing anyone about sensitivity to working Americans. What's tone-deaf is using your platform to mock and belittle instead of elevate and inform. I elevate people all the time, Kimmel shot back, his voice getting louder. I bring attention to important issues. By making jokes about them, Streep fired back. By reducing complex political and social issues to punchlines for your monologue. You've made a career out of cynicism and snark, and now you have the audacity to criticize me for using my platform to advocate for human rights and democratic values? The studio audience was now in complete shock. Some people were pulling out their phones to record. Others were looking toward the exits as if they wanted to escape the increasingly hostile environment. The tension between host and guest had reached a breaking point, but neither was backing down. Kimmel, clearly flustered and defensive, made what would prove to be a catastrophic decision. Instead of attempting to diffuse the situation, he chose to escalate it further, setting the stage for what would become the most explosive confrontation in late-night television history. The battle lines were drawn, and there would be no turning back from what was about to unfold. You know what, Meryl? Kimmel said, his voice dripping with sarcasm as he leaned back in his chair. Maybe the problem isn't that celebrities are too political. Maybe the problem is that some celebrities think they're untouchable, think they can lecture everyone else because they've won a few awards. The words hit the studio like a thunderbolt. Streep's eyes widened in disbelief, and for a moment, she seemed genuinely shocked by the brazen disrespect. The audience gasped audibly, and several people in the front row could be heard whispering, "Oh my God," under their breath. Untouchable? Streep repeated, her voice barely above a whisper but somehow carrying to every corner of the studio. Jimmy, are you seriously suggesting that my decades of work, my commitment to my craft, and my advocacy for basic human dignity somehow make me arrogant? I'm suggesting, Kimmel continued, now fully committed to his destructive path, that maybe when you're up there giving your speeches about how terrible everything is, you might want to remember that some of us are actually trying to make people laugh instead of making them feel guilty about their lives. The studio fell into an even deeper silence, if that was possible. The band looked uncomfortable. The audience was frozen, and even the cameramen seemed unsure of where to focus their lenses. But Streep, drawing on reserves of professional composure that had carried her through 5 decades of performance, slowly turned to face Kimmel directly. "Make people laugh?" she said, her voice now carrying a dangerous calm. "Is that what you call what you do here, Jimmy? Because from where I'm sitting, it looks more like you make people feel superior by mocking others. You punch down at people who can't defend themselves, you reduce complex issues to cheap punchlines, and you hide behind the label of comedy when anyone calls you out on it." Kimmel's face went from red to practically purple. "I don't punch down. I go after politicians. I go after people in power." "You go after whoever gets you ratings," Streep shot back, her voice rising. "You've built your entire career on schadenfreude and manufactured outrage. And now you have the unmitigated gall to sit there and criticize me for using my platform to advocate for democracy and human rights?" The confrontation was now spiraling completely out of control. What had started as a standard promotional interview had devolved into something resembling a public execution. The audience members were looking at each other in shock, some covering their mouths, others reaching for their phones to document the unprecedented meltdown happening before their eyes. But Kimmel, instead of recognizing the severity of the situation, chose to double down yet again. "You want to talk about platforms, Meryl? Let's talk about platforms. You use award shows to grandstand about politics. You use interviews to lecture people about morality. But when's the last time you actually did something concrete to help the people you claim to care so much about? The question hung in the air like a bomb waiting to explode. Streep stared at him for a long moment, her expression cycling through disbelief, anger, and something that looked almost like pity. When she finally spoke, her voice was deadly quiet. "When's the last time I did something concrete?" she repeated slowly. "Jimmy, I've donated millions of dollars to scholarship funds for underprivileged students. I've supported organizations fighting for women's rights, LGBTQ+ rights, and immigrant rights for decades. I've used my influence to shine light on issues that matter. What exactly have you done besides make jokes about the suffering of others?" "I raise money for charity all the time," Kimmel protested, but his voice lacked conviction. "You raise money by making people laugh at other people's expense," Streep countered. "There's a difference between using humor to heal and using humor to harm. You seem to have forgotten that distinction entirely." The studio was now in complete chaos. Audience members were openly talking to each other, some were standing up to get a better view, and others were clearly trying to figure out how to leave. The show's producers were frantically gesturing from the wings, but neither Kimmel nor Streep seemed to notice or care. "You know what I think your real problem is?" Kimmel said, his voice now shaking with rage. "I think you can't stand that someone, like me, someone who didn't go to fancy acting schools or win prestigious awards, has a platform just as big as yours. I think it kills you that people might listen to me instead of you." The accusation was so far beyond the pale, so personally insulting, that for a moment Streep seemed genuinely speechless. She stared at him as if seeing him clearly for the first time. And when she spoke, her voice carried a weight that made everyone in the studio lean forward. "Jimmy, my real problem is that I'm watching someone with incredible influence and reach choose to use that power to divide rather than unite, to tear down rather than build up, to mock rather than inspire. My problem is that you're so consumed with your own insecurities that you can't see the damage you're doing." "My insecurities?" Kimmel laughed bitterly. "That's rich coming from someone who needs constant validation from critics and award shows." "I don't need validation from anyone," Streep said, her voice now carrying the full force of her legendary intensity. "But I do need to be able to look at myself in the mirror and know that I've used whatever gifts I have to make the world a little bit better, not worse. Can you say the same thing, Jimmy?" The question hit its mark with devastating precision. Kimmel's face went white, then red again, and for a moment he seemed to struggle for words. The audience could sense that something fundamental had shifted in the dynamic between them, that they were witnessing not just a professional disagreement, but a complete breakdown of civility and respect. When Kimmel finally found his voice again, what came out would seal his fate and create the most explosive moment in late-night television history. The point of no return had been reached, and what happened next would shock everyone in that studio and millions of viewers watching at home. "You want to know what I think?" Kimmel said, his voice trembling with barely controlled rage. "I think you're a sanctimonious, self-righteous has-been who can't accept that her time in the spotlight is over. I think you use politics as a desperate attempt to stay relevant because nobody cares about your movies anymore." The words exploded across the studio like a sonic boom. The audience collectively gasped. Some people actually stood up in shock, and several audible "No, he didn't" could be heard from the crowd. Even the band members looked horrified. But Kimmel wasn't finished. In a moment of complete professional suicide, he continued his attack. "And you know what else? I think deep down you know that all your awards, all your acclaim, all your so-called advocacy, it's all just an elaborate performance to convince yourself that you matter, that you're more than just another actor pretending to be important." The silence that followed was deafening. For what felt like an eternity, nobody moved, nobody spoke, nobody even seemed to breathe. Streep sat perfectly still, staring at Kimmel, with an expression that somehow conveyed both profound disappointment and steely resolve. When she finally spoke, her voice was so quiet that the studio microphones had to strain to pick it up. "Jimmy," she said, and there was something almost maternal in her tone, as if she were addressing a child who had just said something unspeakably cruel. In 47 years of professional acting, through hundreds of interviews, dozens of award shows, and countless public appearances, no one has ever spoken to me the way you just did. She paused, letting the weight of that statement settle over the studio. The audience was hanging on every word, sensing that they were witnessing something unprecedented. "And do you know why?" she continued, her voice gaining strength. "It's not because I'm untouchable or because I'm surrounded by yes-men or because Hollywood protects its own. It's because most people, even those who disagree with me, even those who dislike me, understand that there's a basic level of human decency that should govern how we treat each other." Kimmel opened his mouth to respond, but Streep held up her hand, and the gesture carried such authority that he actually fell silent. "You just called me a has-been," she said, and now her voice carried the full power of 5 decades of theatrical training. "You suggested that my advocacy for human rights is just attention-seeking. You implied that my life's work is meaningless, and you did it not in private, not in some tabloid interview, but on national television, in front of millions of people, simply because I dared to challenge your behavior." The studio was so quiet that the hum of the air conditioning seemed loud. Streep slowly stood up from her chair, and the simple act of rising somehow commanded the attention of every person in that room. "I've been insulted by better people than you, Jimmy," she said, her voice now carrying across the studio without any amplification. "I've been criticized by brilliant minds who disagreed with my choices, by respected journalists who questioned my methods, by thoughtful people who had legitimate concerns about celebrity involvement in politics. But what you just did wasn't criticism. It wasn't even professional disagreement. It was cruelty for the sake of cruelty." She began removing her microphone, and the small action somehow felt monumental. "You asked me earlier about using my platform responsibly. Well, this is me using my platform responsibly. I'm refusing to participate in whatever this has become. I'm refusing to normalize the idea that basic human decency is optional when you're trying to get ratings." The audience was now completely captivated. Some people were openly crying, others were recording with their phones, and many were just staring in stunned admiration at what they were witnessing. But Streep wasn't finished. "You know what the saddest part is, Jimmy? You actually have tremendous talent. You're genuinely funny when you want to be. You have the ability to bring joy to millions of people, but instead of using that gift to make the world a little brighter, you've chosen to use it to make the world a little darker. And that's not just disappointing, it's tragic." She placed her microphone on the chair where she had been sitting, and the small thud it made seemed to echo through the entire studio. "I came here tonight to talk about my work, to share some stories that might entertain your audience, to be a good guest on your show, but I won't sit here and be abused for your entertainment or anyone else's." Kimmel, perhaps finally understanding the magnitude of what he had done, tried one last time to salvage the situation. "Meryl, wait, No," she said firmly, turning to face him one final time. "Jimmy, you had every opportunity to be better tonight. You could have asked thoughtful questions about my work. You could have engaged in respectful disagreement about politics. You could have been the professional that your position demands. Instead, you chose to be cruel." She looked out at the audience, and when she spoke again, her voice carried a warmth that had been completely absent from her exchanges with Kimmel. "To everyone who came here tonight expecting to see a conversation between two professionals, I apologize that you had to witness this instead. You deserved better, and frankly, so did I." With that, Meryl Streep turned and walked toward the exit. The audience watched in stunned silence as one of the greatest actresses of all time moved. with perfect dignity toward the studio doors. Some people began to applaud, tentatively at first, then with growing enthusiasm. By the time she reached the exit, a significant portion of the audience was on their feet, clapping not just for her performance, but for her grace under fire. She paused at the door, turned back one final time, and with a slight nod to the audience, pointedly ignoring Kimmel entirely, she walked out of the studio and into television history. The studio fell into chaos. Audience members were talking loudly among themselves. Some were demanding refunds. Others were praising Streep's dignity. The show's producers rushed onto the stage, frantically trying to figure out how to salvage what was left of the broadcast. Kimmel sat alone at his desk, looking shell-shocked and pale, finally beginning to understand the career-ending magnitude of his behavior. As the credits rolled over the chaotic scene, one thing was clear. This wasn't just the end of an interview. Gone wrong. This was the moment when late-night television's culture of manufactured controversy and cheap shots finally met its match in someone who refused to play along. Meryl Streep hadn't just walked off a talk show. She had delivered a masterclass in dignity, professionalism, and the power of knowing when to say enough is enough.